As the war enters its final phase in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and as Trump gets ready for his big showdown, the question has to be asked, is the showdown between Trump and Putin or Trump and Europe? Because there seem to be multiple fronts on this diplomatic conflict that's going on, instead of just the actual war going on between Russia and Ukraine. And who better to try and make sense of a lot of this than a former British diplomat, Ian Proud. We've had Ian on the show before. It's been a while. Former British diplomat in His Majesty's Diplomatic Service. It sounds so cool to say that. From 1999 to 2023. Ian, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Danny. It's really nice to be back. And believe me, it's not as cool as it sounds.
Well, it sounds cool to us anyway. I can imagine what it might be to actually do. But the fact is, though, that you have had a front row seat for quite a lot of things, and you understand the Russians much better than your average person, probably much better than your average Brit, I would say, since you actually worked in the British embassy in Moscow for a long time. I wonder if you could just kind of tell us a little bit about what you did while you were in Moscow.
So my job, I mean, I had lots of jobs, to be perfectly honest. But my main job was to make sense of the economic situation. I was Mr. Sanctions, if you like, amongst many other things. And what I chose to do, because it's quite an entrepreneurial sort of career, I got out and about around the country as much as I could to meet ordinary Russian people. And you'd be surprised. I mean, the stereotype of the Russians is kind of cold, impenetrable kind of type that basically hates us in the West. And I think that stereotype may apply to a greater extent in the Kremlin, but amongst ordinary Russian people, I found a genuine warmth, actually, and a desire to understand us better, and a confusion about, well, how do we end up in this situation that we're, essentially enemies and squaring up to each other? Because obviously I went after the Ukraine crisis had started in mid 2014, when the first big round of sanctions were imposed. Even in that context, I was also there during the Salisbury nerve agent attack in March 2018. Throughout that period, I found a desire to engage, but an unwillingness on the UK side actually to reciprocate.
Well, that's a puzzling situation. Obviously, one which I would say mirrored in the previous Biden administration, though it might actually have been stronger negatively in the Biden administration, which then had ramifications throughout the rest of Europe and a lot of our allies. But I want to take a look at kind of where we are now, as we're getting close to the end game here, and Trump in the White House Oval Office a couple of days ago said he thought that this could be over with in a matter of weeks. And some of his senior officials had said earlier in the week that it could be as soon as a deal could be done, maybe even within 1 week. So in terms of that, then one would expect to see the European Union, especially, and really the UK in particular, because of their stalwart nature of our long-lasting alliance. You would think that they would be saying, okay, well, let's start tailoring our message to kind of match that. But we don't seem to be doing that. And I want to play with you a clip by your Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. I believe it was yesterday, really talking about how this war is going to end. But he kind of backed up a little bit and said, all right, let's take a look at how we got here and what the nature of the world we have for us today.
I was a young man when the Berlin Wall came down. I remember it vividly. It felt as if we were casting off the shackles of history, a continent united by freedom and democracy. If you told me then that in my lifetime we would see Russian tanks rolling into European cities again, I would not have believed you. Yet here we are, in a world where everything has changed. Because 3 years ago in Ukraine, that is exactly what happened.
Yeah, but is that exactly what happened? Because the implication there is that, golly, the world was just going on. It was normal. It was wonderful. And then, bam, 3 years ago, out of nowhere, here come Russian tanks rolling into Ukraine. How do you see that?
Well, the interesting thing at the start of what he said, of course, was him clinging to the Francis Fukuyama end of history narrative that somehow we defeated the Soviet Union. We could forget about that. We could all live in happy, cuddly, liberal democracies until kingdom come. But unfortunately, the world has changed with the growth of economies in the developing world, notably China, of course. So he's clinging on to a dead history first of all. Secondly, he hasn't really addressed the why. Yes, of course, the Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine. Ridiculous, terrible war that's ensued. You've been one of the only people who's been saying from the start that Ukraine could never win this. But as you say, how did we get to this situation in the first place? You know, how has a situation arose in which Russia has been expressing its concerns about NATO expansion, not just back to 2008 in the meeting in Bucharest, when actually relations with NATO countries and Russia were in actually quite decent shape, but actually right back to 2006 with the expansion into the Baltic states of the former Soviet Union. How did it take 16 years of Russia expressing its concern about NATO enlargement, only for us never to engage with them, actively to repudiate their right to have a view on the matter, which many people continue to do today? Nobody ever gets to that and engages in a sensible discussion about, well, the NATO issue, which is the core, really the only big strategic concern that Russia has expressed over the past decade and more, and which remains unresolved to this day. Until we have an honest conversation about that, we'll never move forward. But thankfully, in comes Donald Trump, and actually he's recognized this for the first time, and we're having a sensible discussion about it, leading to these kind of groundbreaking talks between the USA and Russia and Saudi Arabia.
Well, we certainly are, and Trump has continued that on. He met with Emmanuel Macron yesterday. Keir Starmer is coming in here, I believe, tomorrow. Volodymyr Zelensky, it was just announced a few minutes ago from the United States here, is coming on Friday to meet to have a minerals deal, et cetera. So it seems that the pieces are moving more and more into reaching an end. But I wonder if you could speak a little bit from your perspective and your observation, especially up close, in that is the deterioration of relations really heading into the start of this war. Because the question is, why would the West, and you can stick with the UK since you know that the best, but why would the West continually ignore all of the signals from Russia, and especially to the extent that you were familiar and knowledgeable in the late 2021, mere months before the war would eventually start, with the warnings from the Russian side kept getting starker and starker. Why would the West ignore those and continue going forward? And let me just add, toward an end with the NATO in Ukraine that they knew, the West, would never happen. There was nobody that I know of, and I've talked to a lot of people who said that there was any chance at all that the West genuinely would issue a NATO Article 5 security guarantee to the instability of Ukraine. And yet that is publicly what they kept saying. Why that discontinuity?
Well, you see, the thing is, even without considering the massive elephant in the room, which is NATO, the circumstances really which kind of bubbled up in the run-up to the Ukraine war was the death of the Minsk II deal. And as I've said many times, including to you, a big part of that deal actually had obligations on the Ukrainian government to pursue a form of devolution, negotiated devolution with the separatists in the Donbass that would have allowed Ukraine to remain intact. That deal didn't extend to Crimea, of course. But from sort of really February 2015 onwards, when the deal was signed, the US and the UK in particular actively sabotaged that, never put pressure on Ukraine to meet its end of the bargain. Ultra-nationalists, I'm sorry to talk about this, but in Ukraine were implacably opposed to any sort of devolution in the Donbass. Actually came out for widespread protests against Poroshenko at the time. Zelensky briefly had a go at reviving the Minsk II deal in 2019 when he came to power. That failed. Just a few days before the war started in Ukraine, the Ukrainian government actually declared that deal to be dead. The foreign minister of that country, Dmytro Kuleba, said that the separatist region of the Donbass would never have devolution. And this was the core principle upon which this peace process had been rolling on at that time for 7 years, and the Ukrainians killed it. With our sort of UK and US in particular support.
And so was there a belief, at least among the Kuleba or Zelensky's, that, well, we've got we've got UK and US on our backs here, so let's just press ahead, and then we can never have to give in to the Minsk agreements and never have to make a deal with these people we don't like, and instead we can get them back and they'll help us do it. I'm guessing some version of that happened, but the question that I have to ask in that case, were they disconnected from reality? Because any elementary level assessment analysis of the balance of power between the two sides would show that that's not going to work out well for the Ukraine side.
No, exactly right. And it's a very good question. But I think they genuinely believed that the US and the UK would underwrite their choices, their political choices. And that choice was to kind of abandon the Minsk II deal. Bear in mind that
which turned out to be pretty accurate, because that's exactly what we did, isn't it?
It's exactly what we did. But bear in mind that that kind of 1 year period of lead up, 13-month period of lead up to the Ukraine war, was a period in which President Biden actually came to power and actively encouraged the Ukrainian side to not give up on the NATO aspirations, but also to not kind of take too seriously and press ahead with reforms, under the Minsk II agreement, which would have kept Ukraine intact, albeit with some sort of devolved federal type settlement, actively derailing the possibility of that. So yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I think that the Ukrainians.
What do you say to the people, by the way? I hear this a lot. What do you say to those who charge that it was Russia who was not going to ever implement the Minsk agreements, and there were several parts of it that was obligated on them that they also never acceded to, and that even if Ukraine had done that and changed their constitution, Russia was hell-bent on attacking anyway? What do you say to those accusations?
Well, I just don't agree. I mean, Russia stuck with that negotiated process for 7 years, hoping for a breakthrough, a sort of a negotiated breakthrough to allow devolution, in the Donbass, that would then have allowed Ukraine to kind of seal its border between Ukraine and Russia, in the Donbass, and so on. Russia stuck with that sort of format of negotiations, in good faith, hoping that it would succeed, for 7 years until they sort of gave up on it, because it was. So I mean, the problem, another big problem with Minsk, and also make this brief, is that actually we underwrote, Ukrainian political choices, not really to put any effort, into the devolution process. And at the same time, we imposed punitive sanctions on Russia, saying that those sanctions will only be lifted if the Minsk II agreement is implemented in full. Well, the Minsk II, exactly. How can you implement an agreement in full if 50% of it imposes requirements on one side that they have absolutely no intention of delivering upon?
Well, that's a little discouraging that we would go down that path, because that just almost sealed the deal and made conflict, if not inevitable, likely anyway. And then Russia finally, I guess their patience ran out after 7 years, and then they took the action that we know they did. Well, I want to get back to Keir Starmer in the near term. Now, that was kind of the lead into the how he views the world right now, how he's viewed it over the last number of years, but now he wants to talk about where he sees it going next. And
I believe we must now change our approach to national security, so we are ready to meet the challenges of our volatile world. The reason for this is straightforward. Putin's aggression does not stop in Ukraine. Russian spy ships menace our waters. Russian planes enter our airspace. Russian cyber attacks hit our NHS. And just 7 years ago, there was a Russian chemical weapons attack in broad daylight on the streets of Salisbury.
So again, really similar to how he talked about events from the fall of the Berlin Wall up to this war. He's saying, listen, all these things that are happening, many of them are factually true. They did happen, but completely divorced of any context as to why they may have happened. Now, how is this playing in the UK among the population?
Well, I think the population in the UK suffers from an absolute blizzard of government propaganda, which is as kind of overwhelming as government propaganda in Russia. Let's be honest about it. And, they have a massive propaganda machine too. But let's also be clear, Russia spies on us. They spy on you. We spy on them. This is how our relationship works. Let's not try and claim that they spy on us, but we don't spy on them back, because that is patently absurd, and we all know that it's not true. So we just have to accept that spying on each other is part of of the game. But actually, what we've given up on is the old-fashioned diplomacy where, with that in mind, we get on with having difficult conversations about the kind of big strategic, because, most intelligence gathering isn't that strategic, the big strategic issues that really matter about security, in Europe. And that requires, negotiation with Russia that we gave up on 11 years ago.
And you know what? I want to get into that aspect here about the abandoning diplomacy and I guess the more, if that's even possible, embracing of the military aspect, because it's classically said you can't have effective diplomacy if you don't also have an effective military deterrent in your pocket, et cetera. And there's certainly some truth to that. But it seems to me that there's a hole in the diplomatic pocket. And so now they're trying to compensate by building a bigger military component pocket. And Keir Starmer has announced they're going to increase defense spending to 2.5%. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail and talk about a couple of other people who have said something about it. But let me ask you just first categorically, from a military perspective, increasing to 2.5% is a pretty incremental increase. It's not a big jump. What are they going to actually produce with that?
At most, they will get 10,000 extra troops. So they will increase total military establishment to about 144,000. Russia currently has 1.3 million sort of men and women at arms. Only 24% of UK defence spending actually puts feet in boots, that hit the ground. Yeah. Most of it goes into costly kind of defence procurement projects. The Pentagon has exactly the same problem, which are massively wasteful, never deliver things on time, and normally massively over budget. So there's huge amounts of waste. 0.2% represents £6 billion, in spending. Russia still spends almost twice as much as the UK on defence, having before the war started spent about the same amount. So Russia has hugely outstripped the UK on defence spending, and this 0.2 pathetic amount will actually barely kind of provide any more sort of people who in any case will take years to recruit and train. So I'm afraid, as you say very accurately, it's a massively incremental move.
Well, in fact, to illustrate just how incremental, expert Sir Michael Clarke in the UK was on Sky News to explain a little bit about how that is going to manifest actually on the ground.
And this comes at a time in which Keir Starmer is talking about potentially putting troops on the ground in Ukraine. Are we talking about an increase, a substantial increase, in the size of our physical armed forces?
I doubt it at the moment. I mean, the army's 72,000. It's due to go down to 70, which is very small. They may take it up a little bit. I don't think we're talking about a much bigger army. If you're talking about an army that was capable of doing all the things the government really wanted to do, you'd be going back to an army of, 110,000, something like that. And bear in mind, it used to be, at the end of the Cold War, it was 180,000, of whom 60,000, 55,000 were the British Army of the Rhine, just sitting in Germany. But we are where we are, 70-odd thousand. The idea, if you look at the head of the army, Rolly Walker, I mean, he's the new chief of the general staff, he says, we have got to be prepared for a big event in 2027, 2028. We can't wait till the 2030s. We don't know what that big event might be, but a strategic challenge of a war-fighting sort. That's the sort of thing he talks about. And he says, we've got to be able to make a brigade, which is a basic unit of about 5,000 troops. We've got to double its combat power by 2027 and treble it by 2030 without an increase in people.
Okay, let's put things in context here. He admits that the numbers are very small in comparison to what they were at the height of the Cold War, less than half. And that was to help, stave off potential USSR, hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops flooding across the border. 2 million, I think, actually was the total number that they had at one point or another, on top of large foreign armies in the rest of Europe, to include hundreds of thousands of Americans were on there at the height as well. And now he's saying that maybe we can get another brigade, maybe we can double its combat power. In comparison to what you just said, was it the Russian military is about 1.5 million. What is the purpose? What is the value of actually putting forth this additional defense spending and getting ready for this well, actually, we'll just keep it there. I'll ask the next question later. Why spend so much trouble to get an incremental combat capability that's just still a fraction of anything that Russia could bring to the table?
Yeah, and just the first point to make is that he was talking about army size. I was talking about total armed forces size. So our numbers are about the same ballpark. But actually, we just can't afford to do any more. That is the hard and embarrassing truth of all of this. We've had to cut overseas development assistance down to 0.3% of GNI because that's the only way we can pay for this pathetic 0.2%.
Wait. If that's the case, and self-evidently it is, that there's limited funds and you can only increase your military capacity by this much, wouldn't it make sense to say, hey, in a head-to-head combat here, the balance of power is like this between UK and the Russians. So maybe instead of trying to spend a lot more money on incremental changes on this part of the equation, we go to diplomacy and try to say maybe we can give them a reason not to even want to go to war with this. That seems to be a lot more cost effective and effective on the ground.
Well, of course, as a diplomat, I would wholeheartedly agree with that suggestion, Danny. And of course, but Keir Starmer's just imposed a $6 billion spending cut on the foreign ministry, which he's given to the defense ministry. Our embassy, in Moscow is now kind of hollowed out shell that has been cleared out of so many people. We're now actually sharing it with the Canadians just to fill up some space. We haven't invested in diplomacy for 11 years. In fact, actually, we haven't really invested in Russian knowledge since the end of the Soviet Union, and that's part of the problem. Try to find a Russian-speaking government. Good luck. We need to get back to the old-fashioned habit of talking to people with whom we disagree, because that's what diplomacy is all about.
Now, one of the other things he said there, or I wanted to ask you, as far as anyway, because I've heard from some other sources I have in the UK, he mentioned there a big event in somewhere between now and 2027, something related to war fighting, he said, and that's what they have to get ready for. I'm told by some who have some knowledge that they think that actually Russia is going to attack into Europe. I don't know why they think that, but I don't know where it would be, how they would think that's going to be possible. But the belief is that after this after this war resolution happens in the Russia-Ukraine war, that Russia will be getting ready, and potentially within just a couple of years, will be ready to attack into Europe, and ergo Britain needs to be ready. First of all, let me just ask on the surface of it, have you heard anything to that effect?
That's all you ever hear, Danny. Russian tanks are going to roll into Riga any moment soon. It's taken them all year to move kind of 30 miles across Donbass. They've totally had to change their method of warfare. It would be another, about 900 miles, to get to the Polish border, and they spent a year getting across 30 miles. This is just weird propaganda to kind of hype up the fear and threat amongst European citizens to a risk that doesn't exist. There's no evidence that Russia wants to actually invade Europe. The political consequences for Putin would be, catastrophic. Even if the US cavalry didn't come to our aid, they would suffer I think still a humiliating defeat on European soil, and it would be disastrous for Putin. Why would, in fact, Putin's even said this, why would he want to take that risk? I mean, Ukraine is a much easier challenge, and even then, it's not been easy. So I don't see any validity in that. I just think it's yet another propaganda line to keep the money flowing.
And one to take a calloused view of it would say, what about the possibility that that's just being used to hype up, like, i.e. that they may not believe it, or at least some may not believe it, but they do want it to hype because they want the money in. Now, here is your defense minister is going to be explaining why it's so important to do that, but he comes in with to me, it's a really curious benefit at the end of why he thinks this should be good for the UK.
I was with Keir Starmer back in April last year in Barrow when we made the commitment to increase defence spending to 2.5% of what this country produces. That's a level we've not spent in this country for 15 years. We made that commitment to the public in the election manifesto, and yesterday he announced that we're delivering that early, 3 years before anyone thought we would, and we're doing that because the world has changed. We need to increase defence spending, we need to strengthen our armed forces, and we need to make our defence industry the driver of economic growth in this country, and we will.
Why would you want to use the defense industry to drive economic growth in UK? Wouldn't it be wiser to let civilian industry drive something that could literally be sustained and would produce a positive benefited outcome for the UK people?
Well, no, he's just a political pygmy. He's making things up as he goes along because he doesn't have anything useful to say on the topic. He's talking utter nonsense. I can't even believe they couldn't choose a better piece of military equipment for him to stand in front of for that sort of press moment. Our economy is struggling. The US economy is performing much better than ours. European economies across the board are in deep trouble because we've been shackled by this kind of decade of confrontation with Russia, massively high energy prices. And he's talking about the only way out of this is more war, and less jaw. It's just utterly ridiculous from a political amateur.
But how does that strike with the people? Because if economic performance is underperforming compared to others in Europe and certainly to the United States, it doesn't seem like it would be a good idea to cut spending in some areas to increase it in the defense industry, which doesn't, other than the individuals who work for the defense industry, doesn't do much for the British economy. Isn't there a disconnection between those two things?
There's absolutely a disconnection between those two things because we buy a significant amount of kit from the USA anyway, so not all of that money is going to go to UK industries. Clearly we're sort of building submarines, we have these kind of projects going on right now, but we import a lot of our kit, so that's not really benefiting our economy either. We need to kind of be reinvesting in actual value adding growth in new sectors, AI, creative industries, and that sort of things, rather than keep investing in massive white elephant projects that take years and years, cost more than they're worth, and often sort of fail to deliver.
And what about the population in the UK? Are there those that make the same arguments that you just did, and they're not happy with this, or are the people saying, okay, yeah, sure, let's go down that path?
No, I mean, there's an almost complete media blackout in the UK. As I say, it is like living in Russia,
Wow.
But somehow worse. Propaganda is so strong here that people are just fed this. And I think most people, because life is still not too bad. I mean, growth is rubbish, but life's not too bad here. Nobody's dying at the end of the day, other than natural causes. So people carry on with their life as normal. They listen to the state propaganda, they get on with their lives. Most people are absolutely clueless about what's happening in the bigger geostrategic context and the ridiculous kind of policy that Starmer is taking us down, albeit just a continuation of the policy of the Tories that he replaced.
Well, one of those people is you, who is not following down that path. And in fact, you have a Substack that you have written, and you're called the Peacemonger. I love the title, by the way. I advise everybody to go and sign up for that. But in a recent piece here, you wrote that the choosing peace is not siding with Russia or hating Ukraine. It is, or it should be, about helping both countries to thrive and coexist in a peaceful way after years of confected and completely unnecessary conflict and hate. How do you propose, and some of the things that you've written about in that article, that either we, meaning the West, or you, being UK specifically, could transition to something, and how much more effective would it be to achieve outcomes that are beneficial to Britain?
I think we need to start with ending the war, right? We can't get into the next phase of normalization unless the actual war fighting stops. If you look at what happened after the end of the Second World War, the way that kind of countries on the mainland of Europe started to normalize their relations was through commerce, the creation initially of the European coal and steel community. At the moment, there's we're almost completely cut off, from Russia in terms of commerce. That will be a good place to start, gradually untethering all these kind of straps that we put in place to prevent us from engaging so commercially, with the Russians. That would allow for a gradual normalization of relations where people just have to kind of, communicate through trade on a day-to-day basis, and then the politics would follow in slower time. Cutting ourselves off economically from Russia, hasn't helped. It's punished us more than it's punished Russia. It hasn't done anything to kind of resolve the underlying tensions, in Ukraine. Once we get back to that sort of normalization, then we can start slowly, and it's frankly going to take a generation at this stage to kind of normalize relations between us and Russia, between Russia and Ukraine too.
Yeah, so let me ask you, so I want to look at this in context, not just in the West, not even just with the UK, but in the broader perspective. Let's look at the Russian side a little bit and examine some of their motivations. And looking at this, especially in the BRICS context, where Russia is not as isolated as we wanted them to be. In fact, you could say that it has been an abysmal a failure on the West part since the war broke out, that to try and politically and economically isolate Russia and weaken them, et cetera. It seems to have had nearly the opposite effect, or at least the opposite has been produced, that they have now expanded their influence economically and diplomatically abroad. How would you I guess, assess the Russia's reaction diplomatically and economically to the pressure that we put on them in the last 3 years?
Well, I mean, what I'd say is that the pressure's actually been for 11 years, not for 3 years. The sanctions that were imposed, and I was very closely involved in that policy, as you know, actually started in 2014. And actually what they've been doing since 2014 is been taking steps to adjust and reorient their economy right from the very beginning. And that's the reason why the massive sanctions that were imposed in 2022, haven't had as big an impact as we wanted, because they've been steadily kind of reorienting, shifting more towards Asia, engaging more with the BRICS, and so on and so forth. So, sanctions, if you're going to have a big explosion of sanctions, you need to do, if there's any learning from this, you need to do it all in one go. The very incremental way that sanctions have been introduced over the period of 11 years has allowed Russia time to adapt, and other things have happened that have had a bigger consequence. There have been 2 oil price collapses. We've had COVID. Now we've had war. These kind of cyclical kind of fluctuations, have had bigger impacts in the short term on Russia than sanctions, that they've just kind of moved on. And now, BRICS is a place where most of their dialogue on sort of economic expansion, collaboration, investment, all those sort of things takes place. That doesn't mean that they wouldn't be willing to engage with Europe. I believe that they wouldn't, that they want that. But no, I mean that they've adjusted very well, and we've in Europe, suffered the pain, not them. And people, there's the political pygmies like Healy and Lammy and Starmer. They just refuse to engage with the possibility that this is true. They're so invested in their own propaganda that they can't see the wood for the trees, as they say.
So what do you think is going to be the consequence of all this? Let's look maybe even to the medium term, not even just to the end of the Russia-Ukraine war. That's, I think the writing's already on the wall for that in one way or another, whether it's the way Trump wants it or the way Putin wants it. We'll see how that plays out. But it's going to come to an end, and it's going to be time to move on to whatever's next. If the West continues on with this prospect in the, let's just say 6 months from now, let's say the war's over and the fighting has stopped and we're beginning to move on. If the West is saying we're going to move on by increasing defense spending to 2, 3, 5%, apparently this is what some of the Trump administration asked of our NATO allies, et cetera, continuing on with sanctions, keeping a lot of this money frozen, et cetera, while Russia is moving on to its expanding BRICS capabilities and just engaging with the rest of the world, what is going to be the consequence for the West?
Well, by the West, I mean, thinking about sort of countries in Europe, because I think the consequences for the US are very different from the consequences, for Europe. But I think the consequences for Europe in particular are that actually you see a greater fracturing of the European consensus within the Union itself, particularly through kind of Central Europe, countries like Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, Croatia, Austria, that are already kind of shifting more, towards a nationalist positions, wanting to have better ties with Russia. We've seen a political shift in Germany with the rise of the AfD, now second largest party in that country, Marine Le Pen. The risk for us is that actually the European project, which first and foremost achieved peace after the kind of destruction of the Second World War, starts to crumble internally, following on the back of the UK example of leaving in 2016. So, I mean, that for me is a kind of the big risk, unless we can sort of get back into a normal track where we're engaging with every country, including the Russians, as partners, not as enemies. And actually, the 5%, the UK, a good mate of mine and yours, Steve Jeremy, pointed out that the UK spent 5% of its GDP on defence, back in the 1980s. You can do that when you have an economy that is thriving. When you have an economy that's on a war footing that is actually essentially stagnating, you're essentially turning yourself into the Soviet Union, which I worry the UK is actually, trying to do right now, particularly under the Labour Party. So yeah, I mean, that is, the risk that the Europe falls apart and we go back to an era of conflict between European states, which is, from this standpoint, unimaginable. Let's hope it never happens.
Well, let's certainly hope we don't get to that stage there. Let's hope that common sense or new leadership may emerge that can make that not happen. We'll watch and see how it does. Before I let you get off today, I wonder if I could tap into your diplomatic expertise and just kind of get your comment on some news that's kind of making the rounds in Washington today, that the presidential candidate in Romania, I believe his name is Georgescu, I may be getting that wrong, has been put in jail, has been arrested. What is going on if you could just kind of give us a quick overview of what in the world is going on with democracy in Romania in NATO?
Well, I mean, I think it's a very troubling sign. He's come out of nowhere. He's more nationalist in orientation, much like Viktor Orban, much like Robert Fico in Slovakia, and that sort of thing. And actually, at the risk that he might win the election before Christmas, they cancelled the elections, and now they put him in jail. I mean, this is a mega step backwards in terms of democratic freedoms in Romania, unfortunately. And the Europeans, and so to say that the Americans under the Biden guys, have just come off the back of failing to initiate a sort of a coup in Georgia, just before Christmas as well.
Yeah.
And now they're essentially trying to do the same in Romania. It's not going to turn out well for the European project, because people say, well, this is patently ridiculous. I mean, if you have democracy is about choice, and democracy is also about acceptance. That's the most important thing about democracy. Results don't go your way, you accept it and you try harder next time round. That is the essence of democracy. When you take away people's choice, then hardline views, you just fertilize the hardliners is still further. You don't sort of make them go away. And by the way, I'm not saying Georgescu is a hardliner, but I'm just saying in general. Yeah,
but the bottom line is that there's a real, basically, constitutional or democracy crisis inside of Romania. We'll be watching close to see how that happens. One other thing on the election front is that there's just elections in Germany where AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, gained a lot of seats. Conservative party basically is now going to have to form a government there. What is the significance of that?
Well, it's very significant because AfD has been on the rise for some time now, much like the Front National in France has under Marine Le Pen. But they still only account for 20% of the vote. That's actually a similar kind of ceiling to the ultra-nationalist factions in sort of Ukraine pre-elections as well. So there's a big question mark about actually whether that growth in sort of nationalism is generalized across the whole population, or whether it actually has a ceiling where it's at now, because the nationalists in France have been around that level for decades now. So it's not clear that they'll ever be strong enough in a very coalition sort of heavy country like Germany to gain the majority of the votes at this stage. But it's a response to the kind of economic stagnation that Germany is facing on the back of choices it's made in the context of the war in Ukraine. The principal one being cutting off energy supplies, which has prompted this dreadful deindustrialization in Germany right now, kind of self-defeating economic choices. So it's a response to that. It's a response to unresolved issues around the reunification of Germany. The vast majority of AfD kind of voters and seats are in the old East Germany. So that kind of leveling up of prosperity between the East and West has never fully kind of happened. So basically East Germans are still poorer than, Germans in the West of the country. So there's that dynamic as well. But I'm not yet convinced that actually this is a long-term threat. Let's see. A lot depends on how, the next few years happens in terms of ending this war. And, getting back to a normal economic and cultural social track of the European Union.
And so, what difference will a Herr Merz have as opposed to Schultz before him? Will there be any difference in German policies going forward with him at the helm?
Well, I mean, Schultz was a bit of a wet lettuce. It wasn't really clear what he kind of, stood for. Merz is from Angela Merkel's party. I got a huge amount of respect for the former kind of German chancellor. He is on the surface an Atlanticist, even though he's been talking for possibly understandable reasons about the need for more sort of independent European defense identity, which is probably, in fact, consistent with what President Trump wants anyway, kind of right now. So, he's very much more on fiscal prudence, which is a core thing about the CDU as well, as was the case under Merkel before. So, Germany has massive kind of fiscal issues right now, has to make massive cuts. That's going to cause unpopularity in the short term. To going to get back to economic growth. So it's not going to be an easy ride for him. But I think what he needs to do, which Scholz hasn't done, and his dreadful sort of foreign minister Annalena Baerbock, hasn't done, is focus on Germany first. Rather than getting distracted by kind of sort of poking the Russian bear and propping up a sort of a rogue regime in Kiev. And I think if he does that, then let's see. I mean, Germany should be at the helm of kind of leading a much more normalized Europe. It's kind of vacated that leadership space over the past few years. Let's hope it returns to it.
Well, let's hope for the benefit of everybody that's what it does. Hope that it turns out good for both Germany and for European. I guess we'll continue to watch that as well. Really appreciate you coming on today and giving us some insights into some of these things, not just in the UK, but also across Europe. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Danny. Nice to see you again.
And thank you guys for watching today. Also, we really appreciate it. Just to let you know, coming up, we've got in about 15 minutes, we've got Larry Johnson and Trump's art of the deal, of the mineral deal. We'll to be talking about that because that's making a lot of news here, and we got a lot of folks interested here. And if you want to know what's really going on with that behind the scenes, tune in about 15 minutes for Larry the Shirt Johnson. See you then.